This video describes how to use the Quick Setup wizard to migrate a forecast from Excel into foreCASH. To migrate from WinForecast, first carry out the steps shown in our separate video on how to prepare your data in an Excel format. Stage 50 forecasting uses Excel as a reporting tool, and so its reports can be fed straight into foreCASH. Other typical sources could be an Excel management accounts file or a P&L forecast. If the source file relates to prior year data, you can import the data solely in order to create your forecast structure of relevant sales and cost records. However, foreCASH can also apply automatic percentage increases or decreases to the prior year data to give a first draft forecast for next year. Some users will already have an Excel file with a current year P&L forecast, but now want to use foreCASH to handle the balance sheet and cash flow calculations. The source data can be added to or edited manually afterwards. So if you only have a sales forecast available, you can apply the wizard to this data and add overhead separately. Alternatively, you can run the wizard multiple times if your sales data and overheads data is coming from different sources. As at the 1st of March 2019, the wizard only applies to P&L data and does not migrate balance sheet data. Let's look in more detail at the case where your data source contains prior year data. You could be interested in the structure alone, but more usefully, you can make use of foreCASH's auto increase-decrease feature. In the example on the screen, the default change is plus 10% in years 1 and 2, but for year 1 sales, the change is set to 15%. If your data source is feeding in 2018 as prior year data, for any sales lines in your source, foreCASH would then apply a 15% increase for 2019 and a 10% increase for 2020. An important consideration when using the wizard is whether to use the source as a one-time or one-shot process or whether to create a linked data feed. Generally, it is recommended that you create a linked feed. If you imagine your prior data still had draft numbers for December 2018, you may wish to have the option to edit the Excel source file with final figures. This could then be used to refresh the 15% and 10% inflated figures for December 19 and 20. Maintaining the feed also gives more flexibility after the wizard has been used. You could opt to treat the various sales lines differently and say edit one type of sales individually to increase by only 5%. Okay, let's next consider a data source with data for the current or first financial year. In this case, your data source already has the exact figures you want, so the figures can feed straight into foreCASH without change. When you run the wizard, you'll see that you have the option to feed in more than 1 year of data. In this screenshot, there are 2 years of data, both of which can feed straight into foreCASH. But if I'm creating a 3-year forecast, I can still use the auto increase feature for year 3. That addresses the key elements of getting your initial forecast data, but in order to think one step ahead, it's worth considering whether you will want to get your actual figures into foreCASH. Say, for example, your data source was your management accounts pack or was a sales sheet which would be updated during the year. It's worth checking the box in the wizard reading also add file as feed for actuals. As you go through the year, you could update the initial data source with actual figures, or more usefully, you can copy the file and then use foreCASH's feed substitution feature to replace all uses of the file within actuals with the second file. It's worth noting, at the time of the use of the wizard, foreCASH will create precise name ranges within Excel to uniquely identify each line in your file. This means that even if new rows are added to your Excel file, foreCASH will still align correctly. To find out more about Excel feeds and foreCASH, you may also wish to review the 2 data feeds video guides on our website. Okay. So I've discussed a number of situations where you would use the wizard. I'll now show you the foreCASH program in action, assuming a situation where the Excel data contains 2 years of data, my full year forecast, my full forecast length is 3 years, and year 3 will use a percentage uplift. I have a blank forecast here in foreCASH, so first of all I'll set the length in the financial year. So I've got a year running Jan to December, starting in Jan 19 with 3 years worth of data. Next, I'll set the percentage uplifts for year 3. I've got 10% as a default, but for sales, I'll use a 15% uplift. I've also got the option to round any uplifted figures to make the numbers easier on the eye. I'll round the sales to the nearest £1,000. Lastly, thinking about any new sales items that will be created. If you are modelling a manufacturing company, you may wish new items to be set up with work in progress and their own finished stock. Here, I'm modelling a wholesaler and will treat stock based on the suppliers rather than the sales lines, so I'll leave these unchecked. I'll now run the wizard. So I'll browse to the Excel file I want to use. I've got a single sheet file here, but you can choose a relevant sheet if needed. I've got a couple of header rows and 2 looks about right for this file. My descriptions are in column A, so that's okay. I'm not using prior year data, I'm starting with year 1. I've got 2 years of data. Column B is being picked up correctly for the start of year 1, but for year 2, I want to start in column P. I'm going to use a recommended option of creating a linked data feed. I will check the box also add file as feed for actuals, and I don't want year 3 to be 0. I'm going to use derived feeds based on our percentage uplifts. Going to the next screen, I now need to classify each of the lines. Some of the classification categories mean that a line's ignored. For example, they could be a header or a blank, or it could be a subtotal. I've come to the first detailed line on my sales section, so I can scroll down or I can start typing. So if I type S for sales, I can specify that row 4 iPads is a sales line. By default, the following lines will pick up the same category. So I'll get to the end and that looks like it's a subtotal. So if I mark that as subtotal, that line will be ignored. Okay, then I've got a blank. Coming into the cost of sales section, mark those items cost of sales. A bit further down, I've got another subtotal. Got some workings related to gross margin, which foreCASH will calculate. So let's head on to direct costs. Got a couple of those. Then into overheads. So overheads can be classified within 3 types. Could have salaries, property costs, or other overheads. First one looks like a salary. Then I've got some property, rent and rates. And then some general overheads. Come to the end of those. I've got some depreciation, so again that can be added in. Just tabbing through the D options. Now depreciation can be treated as a direct cost, it can go into overheads, or you can put it after the EBITDA line, which I'm going to do here. Same for the other. And I'm pretty much through my file now. Down to EBIT. I have got a line in my feed file called interest, but I'm going to leave that unchecked because I want to build that up more specifically once I get into the detail of foreCASH. So interest is going to be coming from loans, so I want to set up my loans with capital repayments and use a defined interest rate or repayment schedule to calculate the interest for me. Or if I've got invoice-based finance or an overdraft, again foreCASH can calculate the anticipated charge based on the cash flow forecast. So I'm going to leave that one as it is. Going to the next stage, just one last bit of information here, which has been pre-populated, and I just want to check this. So I've got 4 sales lines and 4 cost of sales lines, and foreCASH can actually pair those together so I can look at the gross margin when I'm entering my forecast on those individual items. It's used the name descriptions to try and match those, and they look fine. So iPads, phones, headsets and chargers have all been matched up correctly. If I don't want to match them, I can just give those cost of sales categories their own individual line in the forecast. So having done that, I'll now go ahead and build a forecast based on that feed. And 18 lines have been added into the forecast for me. Let's just see what foreCASH has done with those. If I run an operating profit summary just to see the detail of the profit and loss, I've got some sales, cost of sales in there, and foreCASH uses Excel as a detailed reporting tool. So if I come down the bottom, push that out into Excel, it's create an Excel file for me. Just find that. We can then see I've got sales items or sales categories, iPads, etc. brought in. Got cost of sales for each. The cost of sales we saw, salaries line, there's only one of those, so it's just given it a single line, and then groups of property costs, rent and rate, and other overheads. Now, while running this video, we've included some general guidance, but running the wizard itself generally takes about 5 to 10 minutes and takes a great way to get a forecast up and running in foreCASH very quickly. If you need any further help, please contact us via the phone or email shown on the screen. Thank you very much for watching.